is Dr. Amie Steel and I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Research Centre at Complementary and Integrative Medicine at the University of Technology, Sydney in Sydney, Australia. Today I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts on the direction we are heading within the field of integrative medicine and the work we are already doing and can continue to do to ensure our research means something in the real world. To take you on this journey of ideas, I'm first going to highlight some key and somewhat competing paradigms in the current landscape of health research generally. I'm then going to explore how these paradigms can be employed by researchers within integrative medicine to ensure our work is relevant in the real world. Lastly, I'll propose the potential contribution that research infrastructure such as practice-based research networks can make to achieving this aim. Within the contemporary health research and practice landscape, the concepts of evidence-based medicine, person-centered care, and real-world relevance have been growing and evolving in recent years. The most dominant of these three within health research is evidence-based medicine or practice. Most of us, if not all, will be very familiar with the principles of EBM, so rather than covering these again, I want to focus on some important facets of EBM which inform today's discussion. Firstly, EBM grew out of the medical research community and was developed with the aim of improving the quality of healthcare by basing clinical decisions on evidence produced by clinical research, rather than the authority of expert clinicians. A noble and worthy aim, to be sure. To achieve this, the proponents of EBM prioritise certain research designs, namely RCTs or meta-analyses of RCTs, to inform clinical decision-making. Since the EBM paradigm was first documented in the early 1990s, clinicians from a wide range of health professions, particularly in primary care, queried the applicability of those designs in complex interventions. They also queried the relevance of such a strong focus on RCT evidence at the expense of clinical expertise and patient preferences. This, of course, led to a modifying statement from the same group, which acknowledged the value of these factors in the application of clinical evidence. Equally, clinicians from within integrative medicine were among those querying the applicability of the RCT to investigate the efficacy of their treatments and practices. At the same time, the EBM idea began to be wielded as a weapon against what was then termed alternative medicine. With the statement, there is no alternative medicine. There is only scientifically proven, evidence-based medicine supported by solid data, or unproven medicine for which scientific evidence is lacking. The underlying premise of this statement being that the clinicians within conventional medicine follow the evidence closely and will adopt and apply any treatment which is shown to be safe and effective. Of course, the eloquent presentations that we have seen in the field over the years highlights how preemptive that position may have been. In fact, even despite the modifications from the Oxford group responsible for describing EBM in the first place, the realities of EBM still saw research and clinical practice occurring in isolation, particularly because the RCT design focused on efficacy of treatments by excluding potential confounders. This meant that research, whether it be clinical, mechanistic, or observational, was undertaken by researchers in controlled settings. The domains of clinician expertise and patient values were being applied within the clinical encounter after the research was conducted. Through the clinical encounter, the clinician was left to tease out the relevance of the RCT and figure out how best to move forward with their patient's preferences and values in mind. Of course, whatever the decision was that arose from the clinical encounter, the patient still needed to adhere to the recommendation or prescription within the constraints and realities of their life. This siloing of the elements of EBM has proved in many ways to substantially limit the ability of traditional RCTs to answer questions about real-world problems involving real-world people with real-world settings and thereby make a real-world difference. Concurrent to the EBM paradigm, but occurring in an almost parallel universe, has been the person-centered care movement. This movement, while derived from the person-centered therapy model of Carl Rogers, has been championed by policymakers and, to a lesser degree, clinicians, rather than researchers. It can be described as a systematic whole-person approach to healthcare, accounting for all aspects of the individual's needs, values, environment, and available resources. Person-centered care has been incorporated into national and international guidelines across the health and medical community. A substantial body of scholarship has built up surrounding person-centred care, largely in response to the priorities set by these policymakers. In contrast to the EBM paradigm, the principles of person-centred care has been argued to align strongly with complementary and integrative medicine, and empirical data is beginning to affirm this position. These papers represent the first outputs from a group program of work undertaken by a member of the ARCCIM team, Hope Foley. This preliminary research was conducted as part of her honours degree, whereby she worked to map out the principles and philosophies attributed to a range of CIM systems and their alignment with the domains of person-centred care. She also explored patients' experiences of complementary integrative medicine consultations through the lens of person-centred care, both through a systematic review and a survey of patients attending a multidisciplinary complementary medicine clinic. Her work is still continuing, but strongly supports the premise that complementary integrative medicine clinicians do largely provide the person-centred care that policymakers are keen to see offered in health systems around the world. As we move beyond the almost dual paradigms of person-centred care and EBM, the thread that may be said to link them is the growing need and expectation that the evidence of EBM means something to the patient and the clinician in the real world. And the knowledge needed to meet these needs is much more diverse than the research designs preferred by EBM proponents. These are a list of knowledge requirements which are suggested to speak to the needs of policymakers and practitioners. Essentially, two of the groups of primary knowledge users. I think these knowledge types offer us a great framework for reflection within the complementary integrative medicine research field to make sure our research is truly relevant to the people we want it to be available to. For example, we need knowledge which helps identify the problems that need solving. Within integrative medicine, what are the problems? Who gets to determine what they are? As researchers, whose problems are we solving? We also need knowledge about existing effective research that is not well studied. Are we generating new knowledge? Building on existing knowledge? How are we even defining what knowledge exists? Is it only research evidence? Where does traditional knowledge fit? We also need knowledge about treatments about how treatments work and how a treatment compares to alternatives. Is that mechanistic research? What about principles-based therapies? Exploring philosophical perspectives on treatment effectiveness, etc. And what do we mean by alternatives? Alternatives to conventional only? What about alternatives for complementary medicine practitioners to choose between the treatment options available for their patients? We also need knowledge which defines our stakeholders. I mean, who are our stakeholders really? This underpins many of the questions I've raised already. And lastly, knowledge about why integrative medicine. Understanding the importance, the implications, and the value of integrative medicine links it to its wider acceptability. This flowchart on the right is a great example of the application of these knowledge types from a paper published almost 20 years ago. The EBM prioritisation of RCTs answers the question of efficacy, but that does not ensure that the research is relevant for real-world decisions. Research also needs to demonstrate effectiveness and cost-effectiveness, then show service availability and distribution. All of these knowledge types are needed to be able to support the effective integration of complementary medicine into health systems where safe and appropriate. The research conducted by the integrative medicine research community must be able to produce knowledge across all of these types if we are to inform improved healthcare in the community. Despite the criticisms I've raised regarding the EBM movement, I know that the complementary integrative medicine research community is not immune to the allure of producing research evidence that can be synthesized via meta-analysis, translated into clinical practice guidelines or policy briefs, and then watch the magic of them changing the face of policy and practice. After all, that is why most researchers enter the game, to help improve the health of the community through better healthcare. Unfortunately, research alone does not inform practice. Rather, a process of knowledge translation is required to enable research findings to become meaningful to practitioners in their contextual settings. Even clinical practice guidelines do not necessarily result in practice change if they are not designed with the realities of the target clinician community in mind. In fact, there are several reasons why day-to-day practice may deviate from the evidence. Firstly, the burden of practice may mean there is a mismatch between the demand and availability of resources such as time, money, and staffing. There may also be a tension between professional ethics and bureaucracy. Simply telling a health professional to follow a protocol or guideline will not work if the action conflicts with their own sense of professional ethics. It's also important to consider the fragility of the translation pathway, particularly when evidence is perceived to be generated remote to the setting or practice, with the practice is complex or the recommendation is politically divisive. Overall, we have to acknowledge that the translation of evidence into a clinical decision is not a straight path, as much as we would like it to be. I recently attended a knowledge mobilization conference in the United Kingdom where I heard the most accurate analogy for knowledge translation to date. Professors John Gabay and Andre Lemay from the University of Southampton described knowledge translation as a pinball machine, where the ball is the evidence and the many local, cultural, social and practice needs of the clinician are the levers, springs and traps of the machine. I encourage you all to see the journey of evidence into practice through this lens and understand that evidence is not a shiny metal ball, it is a ball of putty. As it moves through the local practice context, it morphs and changes in response to the many local factors pushing against it. And by the time it is used, it is irrevocably changed. That is, if it doesn't just fall down a hole and is lost forever. We need to see this application of our evidence as not a flaw in the clinician's practice, but a weakness in our own evidence. Clinicians need to make these street-level decisions about which rules to apply in which circumstances. Their approach must be more individualised as they judge the patient's values as well as numbers. This approach is better aligned to a professional relationship-based care and, in fact, is the application of EBM in person-centred practice. The challenge we have as researchers is to take proper account for the diverse knowledge clinicians draw on when we design our studies in the first place, to make sure the evidence we produce is valuable and applicable to them. One possible solution is progressing, which is becoming known as bottom-up research. As I've already described, the traditional mode of research or knowledge production has been top-down. In this type of knowledge production, research is the stuff of dedicated experts in universities and other evidence-generating organisations. It tends to be associated with a linear and often top-down didactic approach to knowledge translation. Evidence is gathered and synthesised by a central authority and then is turned into recommendations or mandates for practice, which those service providers are expected to assimilate and account for in their day-to-day work. In an ideal world, this approach should secure a rapid and equal uptake of high-grade, carefully appraised evidence, ensure uniformity of practice and speedy introduction of evidence-based innovations. Even in this ideal world, it also presents a risk that clinicians will implement a set of treatment principles rather than engage in an ongoing quest to be evidence-based practitioners. It may achieve a stifled, obedient compliance with an officially mandated evidence at the cost of using alternative sources of evidence such as practitioner knowledge or professional expertise and intuition more creatively. In contrast, the bottom-up research approach emphasises more locally driven evidence generation. In this more contemporary approach, there are no hard boundaries between knowledge production and utilisation. Innovation is considered to be the product of close, continued interaction among clinicians and researchers. Through bottom-up research, we have an opportunity to find locally sensitive approaches to solve local problems or gaps in effectiveness in practice. The main risk with this approach is that we unintentionally reinforce top-down institutional preoccupations and priorities, rather than genuinely involving frontline practitioners in generating data, creating evidence for improvement, and putting it into practice. Essentially, bottom-up research could mean the ball of evidence putty we produce is already shaped to the local context and is less likely to change to suit clinicians' needs on the front line of healthcare. As evidence-based medicine meets the patient-centred and real-world principles of contemporary practice and policy, a body of work is developing around an ideal which closely links to implementation science called knowledge mobilization. Some might say this is the bottom-up research of the traditional model of implementation science. Knowledge mobilization acknowledges the value and importance of patient and clinician perspectives and insights in driving a research and policy agenda with real-world relevance. Knowledge mobilization also acknowledges that not all knowledge is derived from research. It views knowledge offered by the three domains of evidence-based medicine as equal, and that there is a lot to gain by sharing knowledge between all parties. This is not to say that non-research knowledge cannot be captured and tested in a robust, rigorous and systematic way. In fact, it means the opposite. It means our research methods need to build in robust, rigorous and systematic processes that support the sharing and integration of knowledge from all sources. Models like participatory action research and initiatives like Involve in the UK have been emphasising the importance of public and patient involvement in health research. These models concepts are just as applicable to clinician involvement, particularly when researching treatments and practices that are structurally separated from conventional institutions such as universities and hospitals. So let's move these ideas more squarely in the real world of integrative medicine. In light of the ideas I've proposed so far, I want to explore how we can approach expanding the integrative medicine research agenda to ensure the knowledge being produced is relevant to practice, informed by clinical experience, and based in real clinical environments. For clinicians to consider the research being produced to be relevant to them and their practice, they would consider a number of factors, including if the treatment intervention aligns with their personal philosophy of care, whether the population reflects the clinician's patient base, and whether the treatment intervention reflects common practice. Within integrative medicine, these issues are particularly prominent. I've been exploring the manner in which integrative medicine clinicians, naturopaths in particular, engage with research for almost a decade. This diagram comes from one of the first studies I conducted on the topic, in which I interviewed naturopathic clinicians in Australia about their use of information to inform clinical decisions. One of the key findings from this study was that while research was helping them to better understand their traditional knowledge, this was only truly achieved if the science was directed by the knowledge already produced through traditional practice and experience. In fact, if research was conducted which did not reflect the clinician's traditional approach to treatment, then they considered the research to be unusable. More recently, I interviewed students, academics and professional leaders in Australia and North America about how they see the naturopathic profession needs to engage with tradition and science moving forwards. These participants raised very similar issues to the clinicians from 10 years ago. They want the research, but they wanted to answer questions about how they practice, a combination of science-based and of the more traditional approach. If the research is not capturing the traditional practice as it occurs, then they tend to dismiss the evidence as having any value. Of course, this is a very small piece of quite an extensive project encompassing interviews and focus groups with nearly 60 participants across 2 continents, so there is always more to the story. The first results from the study was published in 2019 and there will be more to come, but the importance of practice-relevant research remains. One of the tools researchers can use to ensure their research is practice-relevant is to design research that is practice-informed. Practice-informed research is based on the idea that evidence used to inform service delivery should derive from a wider range of sources, most notably from those that use and deliver the service. For the integrative medicine research community, that means working with integrative medicine clinicians and users throughout the entirety of the research project. This approach is commonly called co-design or co-creation. The success of co-creation rests on those using it realizing that all stakeholders in the system are interrelated and that we cannot solve problems without the input of the others. It also emphasizes research as a process that, while constrained by rules and conventions, is still a creative enterprise with human experience at its core, particularly when operating in a person-centered health system. And this presents an important question for integrative medicine researchers to reflect on. While integrative medicine practices may be person-centered, is our research. In fact, co-creation calls on all parties to participate as equal partners, requiring researchers to move from a position of expert to colleague with practitioners and patients. This same shift is needed for clinicians collaborating with patients in research. Ultimately, there is a growing recognition of the importance and democratizing potential of early and ongoing stakeholder engagement in the identification of important policy and practice questions, as well as continuing input into the knowledge building process. Expertise in all its diversity still remains a resource, and this can be explored and exploited in systematic ways. While practice-informed research, co-creation, and knowledge mobilization is growing in prominence within the conventional health research community, its applicability to integrative medicine is actually quite profound. The established linear research model that has dominated health research over recent years, particularly as it relates to drug discovery, begins with mechanistic research, progresses to explanatory RCTs, is further examined through pragmatic comparative effectiveness studies, then ideally translates into practice. However, much of the knowledge production within integrative medicine arises from documented experiences of clinician experts with traditional knowledge as a prime example. This experiential knowledge can then be pragmatically tested in practice as it occurs, interrogated in a more controlled setting, and then examined to understand the mechanism of effect. Of course, while this dualism is a useful construct, it's not a universal truth, and this trajectory may not always be linear. But my point is that while conventional health research is developing models to better bring experiential knowledge into their research methodology, integrative medicine, which arguably has more to gain in employing these methods, are not applying these models to our full potential. But practice-informed research is very possible and something we need to be engaging with. Here are some of the examples of research which shows the emerging engagement with practice-informed research within the field. Rebecca Redmond is a PhD student at ARCCIM and has undertaken a research project which explores the treatments of women's reproductive complaints in traditional naturopathic texts, as well as textbooks used in contemporary naturopathic curriculum in Australia and the United States. From this work, she's been able to identify treatments that have been historically associated with naturopathic management of these conditions and those taught to modern-day naturopaths. In some instances, she identified treatments which are still used today but are not commonly prescribed for these conditions. She also identified treatments that have stood the test of time. Through a relatively simple research method, she has begun to systematically document the prevailing expert opinion on naturopathic treatment for reproductive conditions. Bradley Leach is also a PhD student at ARCCIM. Conducted a project as part of his honours whereby he surveyed naturopaths, clinical nutritionists and Western herbalists about their clinical experience of intestinal permeability. A large focus of this study was describing the types of health conditions that clinicians have observed to be linked to intestinal permeability. When comparing with the existing evidence, he found that most of the conditions reported by participants aligned with what was already documented in the literature, but there was also a small number of conditions without current evidence to support the association reported by the clinicians. These other conditions did, however, share a similar pathophysiological characteristics with the other conditions supported by the evidence. For example, current research supports the association between intestinal permeability and autoimmune diseases such as celiac disease and Crohn's disease, which were also observed to be linked with intestinal permeability by the clinicians. But the clinicians also proposed multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, among others, to be connected to intestinal permeability, but this has not yet been explored through the literature. Brad's work presents an opportunity for new research to build on the experiential observations of clinicians and examine whether these new conditions are associated with intestinal permeability through rigorous and large-scale epidemiological studies. Dr. Joshua Goldenberg, who at the time of the research was based at Bastyr University and is now at the National University of Naturopathic Medicine, led a team of researchers to explore the best approach to the naturopathic management of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, through a Delphi study involving the US naturopathic doctors with a special interest in the condition. His study resulted in a consensus-based approach to IBS treatment, which could be further explored through clinical research. Craig Moore was also during his PhD with ARCCIM, drew on existing research which indicated headache patients commonly sought chiropractors for treatment. As there was little or no evidence as to the approach chiropractors take to headache treatment, he employed a cross-sectional survey design to describe exactly this. Like the other examples, his research provides the foundations to inform future clinical research. These are all examples of research which captures clinical insights and experiences using established and systematic methods, the findings of which have significant potential to facilitate research which is informed by practice. While these examples do not follow the co-design or co-creation model, they are a step in the right direction. One of the most important things we can do with research like this is ensure that clinical research that follows is conducted in real-world settings. This leads me to the potential of practice-based research networks to support the next generation of clinical research for real-world questions and answers. The most established and well-recognized mechanism for this is a practice-based research network, or PBRN. A PBRN is defined as a group of ambulatory practices devoted principally to the primary care of patients and affiliated in their mission to investigate questions related to community-based practice and to improve the quality of primary care. The PBRN model gives the clinician the best of both worlds, maintaining a primary practice and devoted focus to community care, whilst having strong and defined links to the research community. Not having to do the research, unless you want to, but having a say in how the research is done. Practice-based research networks are characterised by formal collaborations between community-based practices and academic institutions. They produce research findings that are relevant to clinicians and more easily assimilated into everyday practice. They promote both bottom-up and top-down research. And they enable examination of a broad range of research questions and employment of a diverse range of methodologies. I would like you to introduce you to the PBRNs coordinated by ARCCIM. At ARCCIM, we have 5 PBRNs in various stages of activity, 3 in Australia and 2 based in other countries. These PBRNs each have their own features which sets them apart. ACORN is the first PBRN we formed and represented the first complementary medicine PBRN in Australia. PRACI has 14 complementary medicine professions and is the most diverse multi-professional PBRN for complementary medicine in the world, with over 1,000 members. This PBRN was originally formed in partnership with Endeavour College of Natural Health, but is now housed within the ARCCIM PBRN team. Orion had the largest coverage of any health profession in the world, with 43% of the Australian osteopathic profession enlisted, until it was recently surpassed by ARCCIM, which has 48% of the osteopaths in New Zealand as members. Combined, Orion and ARCCIM represent 45% of the Australasian osteopathic professions. And last is AMRIT, a UK-based PBRN for Ayurvedic medicine. To our knowledge, this is the only Ayurvedic PBRN in the world. The most recent addition to the ARCCIM PBRN family. It is in the recruitment activation stage at the moment. There is also a new physiotherapy PBRN in gestation, which will be called CAPRI, Collaborative Australian Physiotherapy Initiative. Despite the unique achievements of each PBRN, they all share some universal characteristics. They support research in a naturalistic setting. They reflect naturalistic practice. They are staffed by real-world clinicians, visited by real-world patients, in which real-world treatments are practiced, and particularly for clinicians and professions and practices that exist outside of the healthcare system, they're very important. So what makes an ARCCIM PBRNs unique? Well, traditionally, PBRNs rely on big data. And that means that they're drawing on data that's been collected through real-life practice in established infrastructure and databases. However, that's very limiting for clinicians who are in primary practice outside of the mainstream health system. It costs a lot of money to set up that sort of infrastructure, and it requires administration from a central source. It's largely retrospective, so you can only really access the data, or the data that's accessed is really only useful in retrospect. And so if you've got an original new question, you have to set up the ability to collect that data in advance and then progress forward. And as a result, it's quite confining and constraining. And if you decided you wanted to ask a research question and you were missing one key element of your research question in the data that's available, you cannot proceed. Instead, for our PBRNs, we take a multidisciplinary approach, which is supported through a sub-study design. In that sub-study design, we allow the PBRNs are set up as the network, but new sub-studies can be formed all the time, in which the infrastructure is unique to those sub-studies are developed and implemented by the researchers conducting them. What this means is that we have the ability for quite diverse research approaches. And when you look at the quantitative, qualitative spectrum of research, we actually have the capacity for clinical trials, epidemiological research, and sociological studies to be conducted within the PBRN infrastructure as we've established it. So if we return to our original stories and look at how PBRNs can be applied, our ARCCIM researcher Bradley Leach, who undertook that survey of clinicians' experience in treating intestinal permeabilities, shares some of the similarities with the aim of Joshua Goldenberg's Delphi study. However, the direction he is taking his data is somewhat different. He collected his data through PBRN, and as well as identifying the alignment between the clinician's observation and the existing evidence regarding intestinal permeability, he also noticed some gaps in the application of evidence in their practice. So he's now undertaking a co-design project using the knowledge to action cycle of implementation science, which you can see here, to co-create clinical practice guidelines for the effective diagnosis of intestinal permeability. He will partner with clinicians, patients, and industry to do this, and will produce a tool that will apply practice-informed evidence to support evidence-informed practice. If you recall, Rebecca Redmond's content analysis research integrates the expert opinions documented in both traditional and contemporary naturopathic texts. In the next phase of her project, she has surveyed naturopaths in current clinical practice as a method of drawing on their experiential knowledge from treating women's reproductive complaints. She has captured their insights into how the traditional and contemporary treatments identified in the content analysis are used in routine daily care and the value placed on them in the management of endometriosis in particular. Her survey was conducted through PBRN and is drawn on varied knowledge types to triangulate and synthesize to inform an intervention for a clinical trial. This clinical trial could then be conducted through PBRN. As a last example, I want to return to Hope Foley's research on patient-centered care. As I mentioned, this research was conducted as part of her honours and is now being completed through her PhD. Her PhD built on her previous work by surveying patients of 5 professions: massage therapy, acupuncture, osteopathy, chiropractic, and naturopathy, about their experiences of the care received with a specific focus on the domains of person-centered care. These professions were chosen because her PhD explores person-centered care in patients with chronic disease, and these 5 professions were among the most common complementary medicine services accessed by patients with chronic illness in Australia. Her project was originally planned to focus just on massage therapists, acupuncturists, and naturopaths. But based on the existence of Acorn and Orion, she was able to easily extend her project to also include osteopaths and chiropractors. Her project will be one of the first to be conducted across all 3 Australian-based PBRNs. So why bother with a PBRN to undertake these projects? The clinician researcher partnership of a PBRN has really valuable attributes. Firstly, the collection of localised data increases the translation and uptake of these results. Clinicians are contributing data from their own practice, and they know the findings relate to practice just like theirs. Bradley Leach's study, for example, will be that much more powerful because he is working with the clinicians whose his original survey was based on to improve what they do. They are less likely to dismiss his work as irrelevant if they can have contributed to the findings. Secondly, it is an effective, efficient use of some complementary medicine research resources. You will notice that each of the projects I presented are the work of research students. This is not a coincidence. There are other studies using these PBRNs that I could have shown you that are led by very experienced researchers. These students are not operating with large grants and substantive institutional support. They are leveraging the infrastructure of the PBRNs to produce research with very little funding that has real and meaningful impact to not only the field of integrative medicine, but the clinicians they are working with to collect the data and produce the knowledge. I'm not sure what your experience of research funding is like, but this is a very appealing attribute to most researchers I know. And it works for the clinicians too. The infrastructure of the PBRNs means more evidence is being generated in these professions. Hope Foley extended her project to include osteopaths and chiropractors simply because of the existence of these profession-specific PBRNs. Do you think that osteopaths and chiropractors of Australia will benefit from evidence that they deliver person-centered care to patients with chronic disease, given the current policy guidelines are calling out for Australian health services to do just that? And there are multiple other examples of studies that have run or are being run through our PBRNs that would not have transpired had the PBRN not existed. How do I know? The researchers have told me. The value of the simple existence of this infrastructure should not be underestimated. And last, PBRNs create a community of practice. They create links between individuals across all areas of clinic and research that supports practice-informed, practice-relevant, and practice-based research. They offer a network of like-minded individuals sharing a common aim and a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. This sense of community is invaluable among professions that are commonly characterised by solo community-based practices that are often structurally, if not geographically, isolated from other health professionals and services.